Welcome back. You're joining Weekend Dialogue on BizRoundUp, and tonight in our studios we have a regular invitee, a regular guest on our program, senior lecturer of the Department of Economics, University of Colombo, and a member of the Consult think tank, Injrajith Aponso. Good evening and a warm welcome.
A pleasure to be here.
Good to see you again.
Oh, very much.
Let's talk a little about the situation now. I think we are meeting again after a political change. Of course, we met before the election and right after the election, but I think you have more time now to give us an observation of the policies adopted by the government in place now, and of course the way forward. Let's start off with your ideas.
Okay, I remember we met just after the budget, and probably one of the first interviews after the budget.
Right.
I had my views about the budget at that time, and since then things have been so many things have been happening, political arena and the international arena and all that. And my gut feeling is, the way things have been moving around and the way things have been developing, still the question of uncertainty is prevailing around with regard to what's going to happen and in what direction things are moving, and also with regard to the economic policies, the kind of direction that one would expect is not clearly visible. So in that context, I have even more problems with what I said just after the budget, that the budget itself, in my opinion, was somewhat misdirected, and now things are getting more perpetual, precipitated, and unless some dramatic changes that are going to happen in the next half, things are not looking very clear cut.
And I think back then we spoke about the realistic, I mean how realistic the 100-day program was back then. How do you look at it now?
I don't know. I personally feel this 100-day program was not the appropriate thing to have to begin with, because 100 days in any terms is a very short term period, and then you are struggling hard to meet certain expectations which you have set yourself into, and as a result it is kind of eating into your medium and long term directional objectives.
Has the government got lost in this 100-day program by trying to deliver what has been promised and forgotten the larger picture of achieving economic goals of the country?
Because 100 days, there's absolutely nothing you can achieve in 100 days. Even if you make a decision in the
By
policy.
saying that, does that mean we have to give more time to see what this government would deliver, or is that what you mean?
I think as a result, you're entrapped in a 100-day program, and as a result, you have lost your freedom to exercise the kind of bold decision making that are essential to get this economic growth into a sustainable momentum and for the long term duration. So I think, in my opinion, 100 days is more or less getting confused with the political agendas, much of the political agendas and political issues, which are totally distracting.
What could have been done in that case? How should have this government started its work? And maybe, I mean, people had a lot of hope. Those who voted did have a lot of hope, I think, in terms of changing what had been implemented by the previous regime. But what would you think this government could have done right in order to clear all this, the situation now?
I think they should have prioritized and looked at the possible and the ones that require longer term. You put everything into one single basket, and as a result you have a problem of sorting out which should come first and which should come next. Now, if you look at what has been happening in the past prior to this government came in, what we see is, there is a certain kind of infrastructural changes that took place, and
Right.
which are hard to come by, which take a long period of time to establish. But you are given a package which is there now. Second, there was a private sector that was waiting to see a direction, that was waiting for an opportunity to get going, because in the past, I'm talking about prior to the since until the last year, the private sector did not get their fair share of opportunities because the environment was not very conducive
Right.
for risk-taking private sector investments. So they were expecting something that will clear the policy area, that will give the economic environment, which will not have been that politically damaging to the government. Third point is, I think the government has too much of politics being brought into the whole conversation. Now, if you look at channels, there's absolutely nothing about economy. There's nothing about anything else but about politics, politics and politics. Now, this is a good talk show for people to watch, but at the end of the day, it doesn't deliver the kind of things that one would like to see happen.
Talking about the economic situation again, I think the external revenue, this has been a topic of concern when the now government was in the opposition, the need to actually increase export revenue. But do you think there are enough policies now in place to correct things?
Not really, I'm afraid. Even if you look at the budget and the budgetary policies, the budgetary policies should have been very aggressive on creating this export space, because a country like Sri Lanka with 20 million people population, small with no large reserves, resource base, we got to look outward, and the look outward means you got to be looking forward to creating a very strong growth momentum in exports and diversification of exports. But that was not a priority, as you can see. It has never crossed the policymakers' minds. So, but then what you do at the end of the day, you try to do things like expenditure expansion, which are counterproductive, because that put pressure on the cost structures on various institutions. And even if you look at, okay, now this government is talking about enhancing salaries of the private sector people. It's good from the private sector people's point of view, but the private sector want a breathing space and to get things going and make profits and make gains in the whole process. A private sector cannot be somebody who is just delivering goods to people and to distributing cash to the workers, because they have to make profits. So it is quite different from the way public sector would be doing. But then what has happened here is, you are basically putting the two kinds of institutions into one basket because of the political pressure that you yourself has created as a result of the very commitment that you have done.
Talking about, before we come back to that, about GSP Plus, this topic is back for discussion now. I think the government is working to regain the lost facility to Sri Lanka. How important is this now to Sri Lanka? I mean, this facility was introduced right after the tsunami in 2005 to Sri Lanka, but we lost it. But will that make a difference now to Sri Lanka? Because anyway, Sri Lanka will graduate out of GSP Plus facility once Sri Lanka becomes a more developed country. And shouldn't our focus now be to develop our export sector, maybe to meet that demand, maybe in 2020 as the government plans?
I think you're quite right in that sense. GSP Plus will be kind of a short-term breather, but it's not a long-term strategy.
Right.
I mean, you're basically relying on somebody else's generosity in order to make a penetration into the export market. But what really should happen is you got to have a medium and long-term strategy of making the exports more competitive, and not to rely on GSP Plus or anything for that matter. But however, in the present day context, the GSP Plus was lost because of a certain political scenario. If that is the case, that GSP Plus, getting that GSP Plus at least for a short period of time, may be a useful thing. But then the issue is, how long will this last? How long will it take to realize? All that come into play here. So I really don't know. I don't know anybody can tell us, okay, by a particular period of time the GSP Plus is going to realize, and how long it's going to last is anybody's guess.
Right, reaching out to regional markets has been more and more important ever since the loss of GSP Plus, and then India in this context remains a very lucrative market. But local businessmen do not show much enthusiasm in moving there. How do you assess this situation and the importance of reaching out to regional markets?
Well, I mean, these so-called regional markets have been discussed and basically discussed over and over again,
right.
But something is hanging in the way and it doesn't really happen. Now, if you just go back to the Indian scenario, I mean, we have been talking about, first we have been talking about SAFTA, and then various other SEPA is another trading arrangement, where we are more worried about these things, that cannot be permitted for trading between countries. So these have become more issues, right, than actual trade taking place. Now, in my opinion, trying to compete in the finished goods or goods which are dealing with the consumers sometimes is complicated, because we seem to be doing the same sort of business. But on the other hand, perhaps one way of looking at it is attracting more FDIs into the country and getting them to produce goods, which becomes intermediate exports. So India is also a potential, very much a potential target. But I would put my bets on China for the simple reason China does not have the same sort of political baggage with us as India does. I mean, the Indian scenario is still very sensitive. The more sensitive is not the trade and economic affairs, the other aspects of it. So which becomes a hindrance and which becomes a constraint on getting anything done in a long-term perspective. Whereas I would imagine China's scenario is free of all those. It's pure economic scenarios, where if you play our cards right, if you play our position right, I think we should be able to exploit this Chinese connection far more favorably for Sri Lanka.
But the Chinese connection, when you talk about this, are we getting disconnected with China now?
I tend to think that way. I suppose, but despite the fact that, we have said so many noises, especially the Port City project, for example. I mean, if a country comes into something which is a flagship project, and you suddenly comes and say, look, these are so many issues. So then say, look here, it's not our issue, it's your issue. You have sorted out those. If you have an environmental problem, you should have sorted out the environmental problem. It's not our problem. As far as they are concerned, they are a foreign investor who comes and make an investment in another country. So we should handle these things very carefully. And in my opinion, that Chinese scenario should have been handled very carefully.
Now, does this send out a different or maybe a dangerous signal to prospective foreign direct investors into the country? We've been talking about increasing FDIs and the failure to attract the potential FDIs into the country since the ceasing of hostilities. But with this, during this 3-month period, have we actually dragged the country into a more dangerous situation in terms of attracting foreign direct investments and creating a different, maybe a concerned environment for investors, foreign investors?
I wouldn't call it a dangerous situation, but what really has happened is, cultivating foreign investors is a long-term strategy. Investors don't look at whether it is Mr. X or Mr. Y in power. What they do is, they are looking for opportunities to make profits, and for at least a decent period of time of stay. They can't be moving around just because somebody has changed their regime. Now, what has happened in this country? We have brought in this dimension to the foreign investor package and the model, and this is not very good. This is quite bad. And also, even with China, though it is China has been a very close friend of Sri Lanka, but they didn't come into investment and in a big way until recently. So it was infrastructure and all that. Here they are coming into partnerships.
Right.
Now, that also took a long time. So once it come into a point where it is going to deliver, I think we should have exploited it. We should have really exploited that opportunity. And we should be the gateway between China and India. We should be the gateway between East Asia and South Asia. And we could definitely play that role. We should have done that. That should have been the strategy, making it a very apolitical thing and getting the economics right. This is where I have a serious problem of these contradictory scenarios, how they will play out at the end of the day.
How should our FDI policies be placed now? And even the government says that it is working towards a more longer term process, a longer term strategy. Are we to have faith in this?
I think the politicians, they look at the body language as well. You know, you might say various things. You might say we're going to have that, this and all. But then at the end of the day, how the heads of state, how do they sort of interact with one another? How much they are willing to sort of put their cards on the table? Now, these all depends on how well you deal with them. Right. So in that respect, you know, I think, you know, we should really be playing a very non-aligned policy, and at the same time a very business-like policy where, you know, we really want the economic development as a primary goal. If that is being placed on the table, then those countries will also see the opportunity of coming along with us, you know. But on the other hand, if you try to sort of please one at the expense of the other, as it has been happening in the past, I think it is the same scenario, put it in a reverse order. So which is not the right thing.
Right. On that note, I think it's time we wrap up. Thank you very much for your time. We'll see you again soon in our studios for another discussion as this.
It has been a pleasure meeting you, Indeewari, and also being very good with your station.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. We had with us Injrajith Aponso, Senior Lecturer at the University of Colombo, Department of Economics, and also a member of the economic think tank Econsult. We'll join you after this break with more on BizRoundUp. To stay with us.